Okay, let's get into it. Number 10. Gemini 8's death spin. Picture two men in a capsule the size of the front seats of a small car. It's March 16th, 1966. Neil Armstrong and David Scott have just done something no human had ever done before. They flew one spacecraft up to another one, lined the two of them up, and gently pushed the nose of theirs into the docking collar of a target vehicle called the Agena. First docking in the history of spaceflight. It worked perfectly. For about 27 minutes, everything was calm. Then the whole stack started to roll. At first they thought it was the Agena. That made sense. The Agena had a reputation for being twitchy, and the moment something goes wrong, the human brain reaches for the thing it already distrusts. So Scott switched off the Agena's thrusters, and Armstrong nudged the Gemini's controls to steady them out. And for a second, it seemed to settle. It didn't settle. It got worse. They decided to undock. Get away from the bad target, clear the airspace, sort it out with some room to breathe. And the instant they pulled away from the Agena, the Gemini started to spin faster. Because the problem was never the Agena. The problem was one of their own thrusters. A little roll thruster, number 8, had short-circuited and stuck in the on position. It was firing. Continuously. And now that they'd separated from the heavier target vehicle, there was nothing to slow the tumble down. Here's what a spin like that actually does to you. The capsule starts rotating, and then it rotates faster, and the numbers climb until they're turning at roughly 1 full revolution every single second. 60 times a minute. Your inner ear gives up. The instrument panel becomes a smear. The blood in your body starts getting flung toward your eyes and your skull, and the edges of your vision begin to gray out. Because the next thing after gray is black, and the next thing after black is nothing at all. They were minutes, maybe less, from losing consciousness. And an unconscious crew in a spinning spacecraft is just a spinning coffin. And this is the part that tells you exactly who Neil Armstrong was, 3 years before the moon. He didn't panic. He reached up, shut down the entire maneuvering thruster system, the one that was betraying him, and switched on a completely separate set of thrusters. The re-entry control system. The rockets you are only ever supposed to use on the way home. He burned about 3/4 of that precious re-entry fuel just to stop the spin. And he stopped it. The trouble is, the rulebook was very clear. Once you dip into the re-entry fuel, you come home. Now. So they did. They splashed down about 10 hours and 41 minutes after launch, having passed over China on the way, which made 2 American astronauts in the middle of the Cold War distinctly nervous. But they were alive, and somewhere in a NASA office, someone quietly noted that the calm man from Ohio was very good in a spacecraft that was actively trying to kill him. He'd get one more job after that. You might have heard about it. Number 9. Luca Parmitano drowning in his helmet. There is no worse place to drown than space. That sounds like a joke. It isn't. Space is the driest environment a human being can be in. It is a vacuum. There is no water. And that is exactly why what happened to Luca Parmitano is so quietly horrifying. Because he nearly drowned in the one place in the universe where drowning should be impossible. July 16th, 2013. Parmitano, an Italian astronaut with the European Space Agency, is outside the International Space Station on his second ever spacewalk. Everything is normal, and then he feels something at the back of his neck. Wet. Cool. He's confused, because sweat doesn't behave like that, and there shouldn't be free water anywhere near him. The water keeps coming. And here's the thing you have to understand about liquid in microgravity. It doesn't run down. It doesn't drip off. There's no gravity to pull it away from him, so it just clings. It spreads across his skin in a film, and it starts crawling. It crawls up the back of his head, over his ears, and then it reaches around toward his face, and it settles over his eyes, and then his nose. Somewhere between 1 and 1.5 liters of water pooled inside that helmet. Think about a full large soda bottle of water, floating as a single wobbling blob around your face, with nowhere to go. His eyes were covered. He couldn't see. The water got into his ears, and he couldn't hear the ground, and the ground couldn't clearly hear him. Only his mouth stayed clear enough to breathe. Barely. And then the sun set. On the space station, you get a sunrise or a sunset every 45 minutes or so, because you're going around the planet at roughly 17,000 miles an hour. So the sun dropped below the edge of the Earth, and the last bit of vision he had left vanished into total darkness. Blind. Deaf. A skin of water sealing his face. Alone, on the outside of a spacecraft, 250 miles above the planet. So he did the only thing left. He remembered the safety cable clipped to his suit. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, and he knew it led back toward the airlock. So he pulled himself along it, hand over hand, in the dark, trusting a wire, back to the hatch. They got him inside. They got the helmet off, and about 1.5 liters of water spilled out. Now here's the detail that turns this from a freak accident into something worse. That same suit had leaked before. On the previous spacewalk, a week earlier, water had shown up in his helmet, and it got written off as a leaking drink bag. A minor thing. Nobody chased it up the chain, so they sent him back out in it. NASA's own investigation was blunt about this afterward. The warning was there. It was ignored. And a man nearly drowned in the vacuum of space because a filter clogged and a memo didn't travel. Space didn't try to kill Luca Parmitano. Water did. Water we brought with us. Number 8. Alexei Leonov's ballooning spacesuit. March 18th, 1965. A 30-year-old Soviet cosmonaut named Alexei Leonov opens a hatch, and for the first time in human history, a person floats freely in open space. No spacecraft around him. Just a man, a tether, and the entire Earth turning underneath his boots. It was one of the great moments of the 20th century. The Soviet Union put it on live television. It was a triumph. And while the world was watching that triumph, the broadcast quietly went dark. No explanation. The feed just stopped. Here's what they didn't want you to see. Leonov's suit, called the Berkut, was pressurized to keep him alive. But out in the vacuum, there was nothing pushing back against that pressure from the outside. So the suit did what a balloon does. It inflated. It swelled up, and it stiffened, until the fabric was rigid, and his hands had pulled away from the tips of the gloves, and his feet had lifted inside the boots. He had done his 12 minutes outside. Now, he just had to get back in. Except he couldn't. The airlock on Voskhod 2 was a fabric tube. Narrow, exact. And Leonov, in his overinflated suit, had become too big and too stiff to bend himself back through it. Think about that for a second. He is floating outside his spacecraft. The only way back in is a hole he no longer fits through, and the clock is running toward orbital nightfall, when everything goes black and cold, and the odds of threading that needle drop to nearly zero. So he made a decision, and he made it alone. And he didn't tell the ground, because there was nothing the ground could do, and telling them would only start a panic. He reached for a valve, and he began to bleed the air out of his own suit. On purpose. He let his suit pressure drop and drop, past the safety limits, into the range where the nitrogen in your blood can fizz out like a shaken bottle and give you the bends. The same thing that can kill a deep sea diver who comes up too fast. He was trading one way to die for a slightly smaller chance of a different way to die. And as the suit softened, he forced himself back into the airlock, sweating so hard his boots were sloshing, and he squeezed through. Now, historians have gone back and forth on exactly how dramatic the final scramble was. Leonov's own memoir, written decades later, tells it as a desperate head-first contortion. Some released footage suggests a calmer, feet-first entry, closer to the plan. The drama at the very end is genuinely debated, but the core is not in dispute. His suit ballooned. He vented his own air below the safe line to fit back in. And the moment it started going wrong, the cameras that were showing the Soviet Union's greatest space triumph to the world simply switched off. The truth of how close it came stayed hidden for the better part of 30 years. The first man to ever float in space nearly became the first man to die out there. Not killed by the void. Killed by his own suit, swelling shut around him, live on air, with the picture cut. Number 7. The fire aboard Mir. Fire is the thing you are not supposed to have on a spacecraft. On Earth, a fire wants to go up, because hot air rises and pulls in fresh air underneath it, and you can run away from it. And there is an entire planet of open air around you. In orbit, there is no up, there is no away, and there is no more air than what you brought. A fire in space is trapped in the box with you, and so are you. February 23rd and 24th, 1997. The Russian space station Mir has more people aboard than usual, a changeover of crews, and more people means more demand for breathable oxygen. So they do a routine thing. A cosmonaut named Alexander Lazutkin lights a solid fuel oxygen generator. The crews call them candles. It's a canister that burns a chemical reaction to release oxygen into the cabin. They'd used them hundreds of times. Nothing to it. Except this one didn't just release oxygen, it ignited. And what came out of it was not a small flame. It was a jet. A blowtorch, roughly 3 feet long, spraying sparks and molten material across the module, hissing like a cutting tool. 6 men, in a metal tube, hundreds of miles above the Earth, with a torch burning in the middle of their home. Now, here is the cold arithmetic of that moment. Mir had 2 Soyuz escape capsules docked to it, lifeboats. But each Soyuz holds 3 people, 6 men, 2 boats, 3 seats each, so on paper everyone can leave. Except the fire was burning in a spot that blocked the path to one of those 2 Soyuz capsules. Do the math again with that fact in place. 6 men, 1 reachable lifeboat, 3 seats. If that fire had spread, 3 of them were getting out, and 3 of them were not, and there would have been no time and no good way to choose. And the extinguishers didn't help, because this fire was making its own oxygen. That's what the canister does. Water and foam are built to smother a fire by cutting it off from air. But a fire that carries its own oxygen supply doesn't care that you've taken away the room's air. So the crew put on respirators, some of which failed at first, and they fought it, and they waited, and for around 14 minutes, that torch burned until the canister finally exhausted itself and went out. No hole in the hull. No one killed. They contained it. The American astronaut aboard, Jerry Linenger, wrote about it later, and one of the things he said sits at the exact center of why this video exists. He said he survived the worst fire in the history of spaceflight, and that afterward they were encouraged to keep quiet about just how bad it had been. A blowtorch in a tin can, a blocked lifeboat, and a quiet request to not scare anyone. They lit that fire on purpose. It was part of breathing. That's the part that stays with you. The thing keeping them alive turned, for 14 minutes, into the thing most likely to kill them. Number 6. Soyuz 18A's screaming descent. We measure force in G. 1G is just you, standing here, feeling normal. A hard push on a roller coaster might give you 4 or 5G for a second or two, and it shoves you into the seat and makes you grin. Fighter pilots black out somewhere around 9G if they're not trained and squeezing. Now hold that scale in your head, because 2 cosmonauts once rode a failing rocket down through more than 21G, and then it somehow got worse. April 5th, 1975. Vasily Lazarev and Oleg Makarov are launching toward the Salyut 4 space station. The ascent looks fine, right up until it isn't. About 288 seconds into the flight, high above the Earth, a stage of the rocket fails to separate cleanly. Something is very wrong, and the spacecraft's automatic systems make the only call that keeps the crew alive. They abort. The capsule is thrown clear of the rocket and put onto an emergency path straight back down. But because of where and how it separated, this isn't a normal, gentle, gliding re-entry. It's a ballistic one. That means the capsule comes down like a thrown stone, steep and fast, with none of the lift that spreads the breaking out over time. And all of that braking, all of that slowing from the edge of space, gets crushed into a few brutal seconds. The needle climbs, past 10 G, past 15. It peaks at 21.3 G, 21 times their own body weight, pressing them into their seats, squeezing the breath out of them, pushing on the blood and the organs and the eyes. Lazarev took internal injuries from that descent that he never fully recovered from. He never flew in space again. And then they survived it. The parachute opened. The G-forces eased. They were alive, coming down under a canopy. The nightmare was over. Except the nightmare was not over, because they were coming down in the Altai Mountains, near the border with China. The capsule hit a snowy mountain slope, and instead of settling, it started to roll. Down the hill it went, gathering speed on the incline, dragging its parachute behind it, toward the edge, toward a sheer drop, and it stopped. About 150 meters short of the cliff, when the parachute line snagged on the vegetation on the slope and held like a hand grabbing the back of your collar at the last possible instant. Inside, the two men had no idea where they were. They knew they'd come down near China, a hostile country in the middle of the Cold War, and for a while they genuinely believed they had crash-landed on the wrong side of the border and were about to be captured. They fired signal flares. They waited on a freezing mountainside for rescue, bruised and injured, two men who had just been mauled by their own spacecraft. Think about the shape of that day. They survived a launch failure. They survived over 21 G, and after all of it, the thing that nearly finished the job was a hill, and a cliff, and 150 meters of luck. Number 5. Challenger and the crew cabin. You already know the image. January 28, 1986. 73 seconds after launch, the Space Shuttle Challenger comes apart in the sky over Florida, and that forked white cloud of smoke hangs there, and it becomes one of the most replayed pieces of footage of the century. 7 people. A schoolteacher among them. Watched live in classrooms across the country. Everybody knows this part. Here's the part that mostly got left out. And it's left out because it's harder to sit with than the explosion. That white cloud was not really an explosion in the way we picture one. The shuttle didn't vaporize. It broke apart under aerodynamic stress, and it came to pieces. And one of those pieces was the crew cabin, a reinforced module. And it did not disintegrate. It came off the rest of the vehicle, largely intact, and it kept going. It didn't just drop. It had so much momentum that it kept arcing upward for a while, climbing to something like 65,000 feet after the breakup, before physics took over, and it began the long fall down toward the ocean. That fall lasted somewhere around 2 minutes and 45 seconds. And the question that investigators had to face, the one that never really has a clean answer, is a simple and terrible one. Were they alive for it? Were they awake? We know a few things. When the recovery teams brought up what remained of the cabin, they found the crew's personal air packs. These are small emergency air supplies, and crucially, they are not automatic. A human hand has to reach out and switch each one on. 4 were recovered. 3 of them had been turned on, and one of those 3 belonged to the pilot, Mike Smith, and the switch for his pack was located on the back of his seat, where he could not have reached it himself. which means someone next to him, one of his crewmates, in those first seconds after the vehicle tore apart, reached over and turned on Mike Smith's air for him. That is not the act of a person who is gone. That is the act of a person who is aware, who understands something has happened, who is still trying. Now, the honest scientific answer is that we do not know how long any of them stayed conscious. If the cabin lost its pressure at that altitude, they would have passed out quickly and mercifully would not have come back before the end. If the cabin held its pressure, they may have been awake for far longer than anyone wants to imagine. NASA's own report lays out both possibilities and refuses to pretend it can pick between them. And I'll say this plainly because there is a lot of garbage online about this. Those so-called final transcripts of the crew, talking on the way down, the ones that circulate online, are fakes. They were never real. Please don't go looking for closure in a hoax. What's real is quieter and heavier. The cabin came off whole. It fell for the better part of 3 minutes. And in the first moments, someone reached over, in the middle of the worst thing that has ever happened to them, to help the person sitting beside them breathe. Number 4. Vladimir Komarov's Soyuz 1. Some emergencies are accidents. Something breaks that nobody could have predicted, and good people do their best, and it goes wrong anyway. And then there's this one, which is worse, because everybody could see it coming. April 23rd, 1967. Vladimir Komarov climbs into the very first crewed Soyuz spacecraft, and this vehicle was not ready. This is not hindsight talking. Before the launch, technical inspections had turned up 203 separate structural faults in this spacecraft. 203. The uncrewed test flights that came before it had failed in ways that would have killed the pilot if a pilot had been aboard. The people close to the program knew the numbers. The pressure to fly anyway, for reasons of politics and prestige and timing, was enormous. And so a man was strapped to the top of it and sent up. It started going wrong almost immediately. One of the 2 solar panels failed to unfold after reaching orbit, which starved the spacecraft of power and crippled its systems. They fought it. They tried to make the mission work with a spacecraft that was running down like a dying flashlight, and eventually the decision was made to bring him home early, before things got worse. He made it through re-entry. He made it through the fire of coming back into the atmosphere. And then came the parachutes, the last simple step, the part that's supposed to just work. The main parachute was packed into its container, and because of a defect, it would not come out properly. It didn't inflate. So Komarov did what you're trained to do, and he deployed the reserve chute. And the reserve chute came out and tangled with the smaller drogue chute that was still attached, and instead of a broad canopy catching the air above him, he had a knot of fabric streaming uselessly overhead. There was nothing left to try. The descent module fell to the ground, essentially unimpeded, at around 40 meters per second. That's roughly 90 miles an hour, straight down, into the flat country of the Orenburg region. A rescue helicopter spotted it lying on its side, the parachute spread out across the ground and already burning. By the time the recovery crew reached it, the capsule was in flames, black smoke pouring off it, streams of molten metal running down the outside. The whole base of it burned through. Vladimir Komarov became the first human being to die during a spaceflight. And here is the detail that history keeps circling back to, the one that's almost too bitter to say out loud. The flaws were written down, in advance, on paper. The danger wasn't a mystery revealed at the last second. It was a known quantity, logged and counted, and the flight happened anyway. Whatever exactly was said in those final rooms before launch, and there are stories, some better sourced than others, the bones of it are not in doubt. A spacecraft that people knew was dangerous carried a man who trusted them, and it killed him. That's the kind of emergency that doesn't get told cleanly, because the villain isn't the vacuum, or bad luck, or a freak spark. The villain is a schedule. Number 3. The Apollo 1 fire. The moon is dangerous. Deep space is dangerous. Re-entry is dangerous. So it feels almost obscene that 3 of America's best astronauts died strapped into a spacecraft that was sitting still, on the ground, bolted to a launch tower, with an empty rocket beneath it, and not going anywhere at all. January 27th, 1967. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee are running what's called a plugs-out test, a rehearsal. The spacecraft is running on its own internal power, sealed up like it would be for launch. But this is just practice. Nobody thinks of it as a hazardous day. It's the boring, careful, safe part of the job. To understand what went wrong, you need one fact about the capsule. Inside, the crew was breathing pure oxygen. Not the mix of mostly nitrogen with some oxygen that you're breathing right now. Pure oxygen. And the cabin was pressurized to about 16.7 pounds per square inch, slightly above the pressure of the air outside. Pure oxygen at high pressure is not by itself a fire, but it is the most generous environment for a fire that you can possibly build. In that atmosphere, things that would normally just smolder instead catch instantly and burn ferociously. Metal burns. Things you'd never think of as flammable become fuel. And the cabin was full of fuel. Velcro, netting, foam, paper checklists, nylon. All the ordinary clutter of a working spacecraft, sitting in an atmosphere that turned every scrap of it into kindling. And somewhere down near the floor, under Grissom's seat, a bundle of wiring had been chafed bare by a little access door opening and closing on it, over and over, until the insulation wore through. An electric arc. A spark in the worst possible room. It went from a spark to an inferno in seconds. The fire raced across the cabin, and the crew's only way out was a hatch that opened inward, which meant that to escape, they had to pull the door toward themselves, into the cabin, against a pressure that the fire was now driving higher. The design made the door nearly impossible to open in those conditions. They never had a real chance. From the first report of fire to silence was a matter of seconds. The official finding was that the men died of cardiac arrest, brought on by breathing in the carbon monoxide the fire produced. Investigators pulled that spacecraft apart for months. They could never point to one single spark and say, "There, that's the wire." What they could say was that the whole thing was a disaster waiting for an excuse. Too much flammable material. Too much pressure. Too much pure oxygen. A hatch that opened the wrong way. It didn't need a dramatic failure of deep space technology. It needed a frayed wire on a quiet afternoon. Everything about how we build crude spacecraft afterward, the mixed gas atmosphere at launch, the flame-resistant materials, the hatch that swings outward and opens in seconds, all of it is written in the memory of 3 men who died on the ground, on a day that wasn't even supposed to be dangerous. Number 2. Soyuz 11. Of all the ways this list could end, before the last one, this is the one that gets under my skin the most. Because there is no fire, no explosion, no scream of tearing metal. There's just a soft click, and then silence, and then a perfect landing with 3 dead men inside. June 1971. The crew of Soyuz 11, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Petsayev have just completed a genuinely historic mission. They were the first crew to live aboard the world's first space station, Salyut 1. 3 weeks in orbit, a triumph for the Soviet program. And on June 30th, they undock, they fire the engines, and they begin the ride home. On the ground, everything looks nominal. The tracking is clean. The capsule is right on course. Now, one detail about that capsule. To fit 3 men inside, the Soviets had made a hard choice years earlier. They didn't wear pressure suits. There simply wasn't room for 3 suited cosmonauts in that cabin. so they flew in cloth flight suits, trusting the hull of the spacecraft to keep the air in. On a good day, that's fine. The hull holds. This was not a good day. As the descent module separated from the rest of the spacecraft, explosive bolts fired to push the sections apart. That's normal. That's how it's supposed to work. But the shock of those bolts firing jolted open a small pressure equalization valve. This valve is meant to open low in the atmosphere, a few kilometers up, to let outside air in and balance the cabin before landing. Instead, it came open early. Far too early. At an altitude of about 168 kilometers, which is to say, in space, in vacuum. And once that valve was open to vacuum, the air in the cabin had somewhere to go, and it went. Fast. In seconds, the cabin emptied of everything, keeping them alive. One of the men, Patsayev, seems to have understood, and reached to try to close the valve by hand, in the dark, in the seconds he had. He couldn't reach it in time. Nobody could have. Exposure to vacuum does something quiet and terrible to the human body. The autopsies found hemorrhaging in the blood vessels of their brains, bleeding in their inner ears, in their sinuses, the gases in their blood coming out of solution and rupturing the small vessels. It was fast. And then the capsule kept flying, on its own, perfectly. The automatic systems didn't know anything was wrong, because nothing mechanical was wrong. The parachute deployed on schedule. The soft landing rockets fired at the right instant. The capsule touched down gently on the flat grass of the steppe, upright, on target, exactly as designed. The recovery team ran up to it, elated, ready to celebrate a returning crew. They knocked on the hatch. No answer. They opened it, and they found the three of them still in their seats. No external marks. Looking almost like they were resting. All three already gone. To this day, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev are the only human beings who have died in space itself, above the line where the air ends. And the thing I can't shake is the shape of it. Everything worked. The landing was flawless. The disaster had already happened. Silently, hundreds of kilometers up, and the spacecraft carried it down to Earth with no idea it was carrying anything but the living. Number 1. Valentin Bondarenko, the erased cosmonaut. Every name on this list so far you could find. There were funerals. There were reports, eventually, even if some of them came late and grudging. The world knew these people had lived and died. This last one is different. Because for about 20 years, the world was not permitted to know he had ever existed at all. His name was Valentin Bondarenko. He was born in 1937, and he was the youngest of the original 20 cosmonauts the Soviet Union selected in their first group. The same group as Yuri Gagarin, a fighter pilot, well-liked, at the very start of what should have been an extraordinary life. And in March of 1961, just a few weeks before Gagarin would become the first human in space, Bondarenko was finishing a grueling training exercise. A 15-day stint alone inside a low-pressure isolation chamber, testing whether a body and a mind could hold up to long stretches of solitude and thin air. To keep the pressure workable, the chamber's atmosphere had been enriched with oxygen. A lot of it. At least half oxygen, by many accounts. And if that detail makes the hair on your neck stand up, it should. Because we've already stood in exactly this danger twice tonight, and America hadn't even learned it yet. Near the end of the run, Bondarenko did a small, ordinary human thing. He'd had medical sensors taped to his skin, and he peeled them off and cleaned the spots with a bit of cotton soaked in alcohol. And he tossed the used cotton aside, and it landed on the coil of a hot plate he'd been using to make himself a cup of tea. In ordinary air, that's a little flare and a bad smell. In an atmosphere that was half oxygen, it was a bomb. The fire bloomed instantly, and it caught his clothing. And in that sealed high-pressure chamber, it could not be opened quickly. And by the time they reached him, the damage was catastrophic. He lived for a short time after. he did not survive. And then the Soviet state did the thing that puts him at number 1 on this list. It decided he had never happened. His death was not announced. His membership in the cosmonaut corps was hidden. And they went into the official photographs, the proud group portraits of the first cosmonauts, and they airbrushed him out, painted him away. Where a young man had stood among his fellow pilots, there was now just a gap, smoothed over, as if the space had always been empty. A British researcher, going through these images years later, found not just Bondarenko, but several people scrubbed from the early Soviet photos. Human beings deleted with a brush. The truth of what happened to him didn't reach the wider world until 1980. And Soviet citizens didn't read the full story in their own press until 1986. Now sit with the timing of it. Bondarenko burned to death in a pure oxygen fire in a sealed chamber in 1961. 6 years later, in 1967, Grissom, White, and Chaffee burned to death in a pure oxygen atmosphere in a sealed capsule. And we called it Apollo 1, and it stunned America as an unimaginable, unprecedented tragedy. Unprecedented. Except it wasn't. The exact lesson had already been paid for in full by a young man in Moscow, and then it had been locked in a vault and painted over so that no one on the other side of the world could learn from it. The secret didn't just erase a person, it erased a warning. That's the thing about a space emergency that's too brutal for the media. It isn't only that the details are hard to look at, though they are. It's that a secret has a cost, and the cost is almost never paid by the people who keep it. The cost gets paid later, by someone else, in another sealed room, breathing pure oxygen, with no idea that this has all happened before. We go to space to see further than anyone ever has. And the most disturbing detail of all is how much of what it costs us we've chosen not to see. Thank you for watching and sticking till the end. We've got plenty more videos coming in the future. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss them. See you in the next one.